Good afternoon. I'm Marianne Christensen. I'm the founder and executive director of the Hannah Grimes Center in Keene, New Hampshire. Along with our partners at the Keene Sentinel, we have the good fortune to pull together the Radically Rural Summit. And I say that because it puts us at the hub of amazing people and amazing ideas. I'd like to thank our speakers, our panelists, our judges, our pitchers, our track leaders, and our staff, all of whom have worked early mornings, late nights, and very busy days to bring forth the ideas that you heard today. And to all of you who are working early mornings, late nights, and very busy days to bring forth ideas in your communities. We are honored by your presence here today, and we thank you for being part of this community here today. And thank you all for your patience and generosity of spirit in navigating the technology that's been required to be here today. Hannah Grimes is a center for entrepreneurship. As we moved from a strong ethic of building relationships, shared space, and supportive networks face-to-face, to finding ways of doing that online, we found a like-minded partner in Eureka.biz, which was founded just last November to serve underserved entrepreneurial communities, Black, Brown, LGBTQ, and rural entrepreneurial communities. And when Eureka generously offered free space on their platform to host recordings from this event and an ongoing live feed, we took them up on it. So please sign in as the entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs that you are. If you follow the link that we sent to attendees, or follow the link that is in the Eureka trade show booth, that will take you directly into the Radically Rural group. I know it is yet another tech platform to log into, and it's the end of the long day. And if I were you, I wouldn't do it, to be perfectly honest. So I might suggest, if you are at that point, to perhaps share a cup of coffee in the morning with that task and get in. But it is where the recordings will be tomorrow. Any resources that speakers and panelists are sharing out will also be there. But more importantly, when you log in, we'll be getting recordings up starting tomorrow and probably running through Monday. But you can start immediately sharing your ideas. You can ask questions there. You can let us know about events or workshops that you are having, and you can continue to build the connections that you started today and new ones with peers from across the country. I have the distinct privilege to present the winners for the Livability Slam. I hope that you had the opportunity to see them on the main stage today a little bit earlier. We want to thank everyone who submitted ideas for the Idea Slam. They did create a video. It was a little bit of work, and they shared their inspiring stories with all of us. So we're very grateful for that. We also want to thank all of you that watched the presentations and showed your support in the polls. There were 3 categories, and the results were very close in all 3 categories. So it was clear that it was tough decisions for our viewers. So the results for the first Lure Livability Slam in the category of innovation. In 3rd place was the Taos County Economic Development Center. In 2nd place for innovation is the Rocky Mountain Youth Corps. And their 1st place innovation winner is TILT, Taos Initiative for Life Together. So that's the first category. The second category is most inspirational. In 3rd place, we had Rocky Mountain Youth Corps. In 2nd place, we had TILT. And the 1st place winner for most inspirational concept is Maine Music and Health. And for best overall presentation, Third place goes to Maine Music and Health. Runner-up for best overall presentation was Tilt. And the first place winner for best overall presentation was the Rocky Mountain Youth Corporation. So congratulations to all of you, and thank you to all of you for participating. Krista Burdick, who's the Community Engagement Officer for LORE, said that the LORE Foundation is really proud to be part of this year's Radically Rural Remote and to bring the Livability Slam to this event. They've done it in other places, and they warmly thank all of the participants and viewers. So now the moment that we're all waiting for, this 4 o'clock time, is really for our closing keynote. And I just wanted to share a little bit about kind of what we were looking for in a keynote. In our early conversations about who we wanted to attend the Radically Rural Summit, this is 3 years ago, we knew that we wanted peers. We wanted thinkers and we wanted doers. People that are getting things done, people that never stop thinking about how to make their community better. Our 2 keynote speakers for this year were carefully selected for their lifetime commitment for doing the work. No academic exercise for either of them is this. Our closing keynote speaker is John Molinaro. In 1790, he's not that old. In 1979, while he was attending seminary, John realized that he had a different calling. He had grown up in a declining industrial town of 30,000 where many families had been reduced to poverty. He realized he had a passion for lifting up the economies of rural places and providing opportunities for struggling families to prosper. For more than 40 years, John has pursued that calling, working across America to help small communities and rural regions build jobs and philanthropic resources that provide better lives for people who have been left behind and all but forgotten. From West Central Minnesota, actually my hometown of Fergus Falls, we found out we had that in common after we had asked him. So from West Central Minnesota to Appalachia to the Aspen Institute, John has worked in the trenches. His expertise has been sought by governors, the Federal Reserve Bank, the White House, and the SBA. In these challenging times, I look forward to hearing his perspective that a good crisis is a terrible thing to waste, but is a time that gives energy and impetus to change. So I ask you to join me in welcoming, and I cannot help but clap here, join me in welcoming John Molinaro. Welcome, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. I hope that I was the only one experiencing an echo through your remarks, and my apologies. I am experiencing an echo now, and so if somebody can help me figure out why that might be happening. Okay, I'm seeing that there are organizers also hearing it, and I'm not sure how well one can listen. This is going to be interesting because apparently others are not hearing it and I'm the only one experiencing it. I'm going to give this a try. This could be a little bit difficult for me to do if I'm continually hearing an echo as I try to speak. So let me try one other thing that might help with that, and then I will. Okay, please let me know if please let me know if you have difficulty hearing me. So I'm very pleased to be here on main stage this afternoon. Let's pretend that I'm in Keene, New Hampshire, and am able to generate the kind of energy that happens when a keynote engages with the audience. You heard from the comments by Mary Ann that I'm essentially a rural development guy. Twice now, I've joined with communities and created from scratch the kind of success that we're going to discuss in this keynote session this afternoon. And in between, I worked with the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group and helped communities in 35 states move towards their own prosperity and their own success in rebuilding their communities. So with today's keynote, you're going to be learning from research and example about three key characteristics that differentiate rural places that prosper despite the odds. You'll hear a bit about stories of rural places that revitalize their communities and develop these characteristics. We'll explore some of the lessons learned and some of the more common pitfalls to avoid. And we'll take home some links to resources that can help you think about how to incorporate these characteristics into the places where you work. So what are the three key characteristics of successful rural places? Well, the first is collaborative leadership. The second is an assets approach. And the third is a development hub. And I'll talk a little bit about what each of these means. Well, talking about collaborative leadership, one of the experiences I had back in 1987 when I first started working in West Central Minnesota was have a local newspaper publisher, Dave Simpkins from the Grant County Herald, say, out here, you can't separate who you are from what you do. And truly, that is a characteristic of rural communities. People in your community know you in various aspects of your life. You can't be you can't be one type of person at work, another type of person at home, a third type of person at work, and not have people recognize that you're not being the same person in all those places. Memories in rural communities are multi-generational. The Smith farm at the end of the road may not have had a Smith living on it for 75 years, but people remember the family that was there and named the place. And it becomes that and stays that for long periods of time. And so the consequences of failure are very high.
John?
Yes.
Mary and I are going to rescue you from your echo.
Oh, okay.
Yep. You probably have both front stage and backstage open. If you want to mute and turn off your camera, I'll let Mary work it out with you on the backstage, and I will sing and dance in the meantime. But I don't want him to have to talk for 40 minutes hearing himself echoing. So I have a closing that I chose not to use today, and I'm just going to, rather than sing and dance, which might not be as fun for you, I just want to leave another thought with you. I guess I have an opportunity to
I think I figured it out. Thank you.
You don't get to hear it. You're going to have to wait till next year. Okay.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead, Mary Ann.
Well, it's just this idea of succession. I talked to you about this, John. I'm not using it today, but it was really this idea of thinking about all the forest fires burning and what all of that has meant, and kind of how I've thought about that and how we recover from forest fires. And I do believe we can feel that often our rural communities have burned and been burned in some way. And this idea of, succession planning, that seeds blow in from the outside, that maybe a few things are left that keep growing, some of those assets that are remaining, but hoping that today's ideas are some of those seeds that blow into your communities. So anyway, I'm glad you can talk without an echo and go forth. I'm disappearing.
And my apologies to everyone if I sounded a bit disjointed. It is a little bit hard when 15 seconds after you say something, you hear it in your head, coming out of your speakers as you're trying to say the next thing. So my apologies for that. I was talking about collaborative leadership. I was talking about how in rural places, memories are multi-generational. The consequences of failure are very high, not just for you, but for your family, because people remember you and think of you in the context of your whole life and the family you come from. So people are often a bit afraid in rural communities to step out and take on individual leadership because of those high consequences of failure. And when people do join together in small groups to lead and don't lead in a real collaborative way, individual leaders can lose followers when the going gets tough because people are concerned about that impact on their family and their reputation. So collaborative leadership is a model that shares responsibility, it shares credit, and it shares blame. And by sharing blame, it diffuses it and it doesn't end up sticking to the individual as you go forward. So what does that look like in a community? Well, first off, it's highly participatory. Collaborative leadership doesn't work unless you're intentionally inclusive, unless you're making sure that you're bringing in everybody in the community who wants to be involved. There's shared responsibility. Everyone contributes what they can. In some cases, it may be very little. In some cases, it may be a lot, but all of those contributions are valued. There's a shared risk. The wins of a community belong to everyone, and the failures belong to no one. And then there's shared credit and celebration of success together that allows everyone in the community to feel good when you have a win. So just for a brief example of this, in New York Mills, Minnesota, they began working with a collaborative leadership model through what they call Tuesday economic development breakfasts. Every Tuesday morning in the local library meeting room, anybody in the community who wanted to get together and talk about the future of the community was welcome to come. Coffee was free. If you wanted a donut, you threw a buck in. And they did this every week, week in, week out for years. As a result of that, whenever anything was changing in the community, it had been thoroughly talked out. Everybody knew what was happening. There were no rumors. People supported it. Things went through city government without that needed to happen there without controversy. And that community took that collaborative leadership approach and used it to revitalize themselves. One of the best examples out there, but this is something anybody can do with a tool as simple as Tuesday economic development breakfasts. And then why an asset? Why is an asset approach a common characteristic of communities that succeed over time? First, it's a research-based model for development. It grew out of the work of John McKnight and John Kretschmann in the 1990s, something that they called the asset-based community development approach. There's still a lot of information online about their research and their work, but what they showed through research was that places that build from their assets, from the things that they already have going for them, do much better over time than those that focus on trying to fix problems or that approach things from the standpoint of we are broken. More recently, the assets approach started to incorporate what's called a triple bottom line method, where people begin to balance and consider the impacts, not just on the economy of a community when they're developing it, but also on the people of the community and the environment of the community. And then a few years after those triple bottom line approaches started to begin being considered, you started to see portions of Michael Porter's work on value chains morph into the work, the assets-based approach in communities. Porter's work talks about how if you build on relationships between producers and customers, you can increase value, bringing knowledge of markets back to local enterprises. When you apply that to community development, you end up with more effective results. And so about 10 years ago, the Ford Foundation financed a fairly substantial initiative to bring these various trains of thought together and into what they ended up calling a wealth creation value chain approach, and turned into a curriculum called WealthWorks. But what WealthWorks does, and what the wealth creation value chain approach does, is pull together all of these earlier strands in asset-based development into a coherent framework with tools to help you get started. So when you start looking at an assets approach, what are you going to see? What does that approach look like? Well, first, obviously, it builds on the assets you have. They could be natural resources, it could be industry expertise, something that was made in your community and not very many other places. It could be facilities and infrastructure you have in your community. In Fergus Falls, Minnesota, where Marianne mentions, one of those assets was an old insane asylum facility, a Kirkbride facility that was 1 million square feet of historic structure, which the community's been building on in recent years. Could be your culture, your heritage. In Gee's Bend, Mississippi, I'm sorry, the incredible quilting that was developed by local residents was an asset that they developed. Could be skills that you have. It could be knowledge. Anything that your community sees as an asset can be the starting place for an asset-based approach. The second thing a wealth creation asset-based approach does is tries to do no harm or less harm. So many times rural communities have developed with an extractive model where you rip the resources out of the ground with little consequence for future generations. An assets-based approach consciously looks at doing no harm or remediating the harm as you do it so that your rural place doesn't degrade over time. It connects those local assets to broader markets, and this is critical. It looks at what you have, who's out there who wants it, who might pay for it, that will bring money back into your community, builds knowledge of those markets, and adapts what's being done locally to better and more effectively tap into those markets. And it tries to maintain local ownership and control. So many times with rural enterprises, somebody built it, they sell it to distant stockholders or investors, and it goes away. It's happened over and over again in Appalachian, Ohio, where I am now, and in most parts of rural America. So to the extent that you can work on and intentionally work to maintain local ownership and control as you build an assets-based approach in your area, you're going to maintain it better over time. And an example of that would be one that we're using here in Appalachian, Ohio, where we've got some of the best hardwood forests in the world, and we've got furniture industry that probably by the number of businesses has the largest number of remaining hardwood furniture manufacturers of fine furniture left in North America, mostly Amish firms. And so since 2013, we've been working at building those supply chain relationships so that we're no longer exporting 3/4 of the hardwood we harvest here in its 2 lowest value forms as logs and green lumber, but instead are drying more of it here, using more of it here, and producing higher value products here. So more of the value derived from our forests, which are sustainably managed, comes back into our community. And then why is a development hub an important thing for a community to do better over time? Well, many rural areas lack capacity, and that's one of the things that holds them back. They don't have the people, the skills, the talents, the resources, the institutions in order to create and sustain growth. So there's been 30 years of research done on rural places that succeed, and almost all of that research points back to rural places that have what that research has called historically an effective intermediary organization, as those regions that demonstrably do better than those that don't. But that hasn't been very actionable until recently, because there's been very little information available about what makes for an effective intermediary. But all that changed last fall when the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group, where I worked until 2012, published a new report on rural development hubs, as they've branded these effective intermediaries, that describes the characteristics of an effective rural intermediary and provides very concrete information about how they got started, how they work, what some of the pitfalls are, what are some of the things you have to have an effective intermediary. So what does one of these effective rural development hubs look like? Well, first, there's no cookie cutter approach in terms of type of organization. It can be a community foundation, a community action organization, some other kind of nonprofit. Oftentimes it's a community development financial institution. Sometimes it's a regional development organization, like an economic development district, or in the Appalachian region, an Appalachian Regional Commission rural development district, local development district. But it can be any type of organization that serves as the host for a rural development hub. But scale really matters for a rural development hub. This isn't something that's usually done just for one town or just for one county, unless it's a pretty big city or a pretty big county, because there are economics of scale in order to provide the kind of capacity that rural communities need. So joining with your neighboring counties and your neighboring towns to create a hub makes a great deal of sense. That a hub provides the capacity to help the communities that participate in it fulfill their aspirations. An effective rural development hub doesn't dictate the agenda. The agenda is driven by the people and the communities and the businesses, but it's also opportunistic and entrepreneurial. So once it knows the agenda of local places, if a grant opportunity comes along, or there's the opportunity for a social enterprise, if there's a funding stream, if there's something that you need to move quickly on, the hub is usually in a position to do that because it understands the aspirations of the places it serves. An effective rural development hub has staff that help pull efforts together and keep them moving. Just like the staff that helped pull together today's Radically Rural session. Without that nucleus, something effective and valuable like this session today just doesn't happen. And it builds administrative capacity to manage grants, to assemble local resources, to attract outside funding. And you'll see examples of what these hubs look like in the next two segments, which are success stories that illustrate these approaches. The first that I'm going to tell you is probably one of the best known success stories in rural America. It's the story of Tupelo in Lee County, Mississippi. And the second is the story of West Central Minnesota, which is a story I lived for 20 years working in West Central Minnesota. So Tupelo and Lee County are in far northeast Mississippi. They're a little over an hour's drive from Memphis. And in the 1950s, Tupelo and Lee County were a very, very poor part of America. Lee County was the poorest county in Mississippi, which was the poorest state in America in the 1950s. This picture is actually a typical home in the community from that time. The economy was primarily small crop farms. They got their income once a year. They plant their crops in the spring after taking out a seed loan. They'd put the crops in the ground. The rains might come, they might not come. The storms might damage the crops or they might nourish them. And if they had a good year, they could pay off their full loan at the end of the year and they'd have some money left to live on for the rest of the year. And so the farmers were very low spending, except when they knew that they had a good harvest and money for next year. And they were very debt averse. And so that spilled over into Main Street. They didn't do much business on Main Street. There was little beauty. There were no desirable natural resources. And this not very attractive home, by the way, though, was the childhood home of Elvis Presley, which is probably Tupelo's most known asset and personality. Main Street was in decline. It was very hard to find hope in the community when a young entrepreneur by the name of George McLean bought what he later described as a bankrupt newspaper from what he described as a bankrupt bank. And he tried very hard for several years to make a go of it, but he realized that the newspaper was doomed unless the local economy improved. So George adopted a collaborative leadership model, although I'm sure that he wasn't calling it then, of recruiting other local business owners with a promise of more business if they worked together to build up the community. They recognized that their local businesses wouldn't do better until the people that used them did better and had more money to spend, and that Tupelo needed a bigger pie for all, not a bigger slice of the pie for some. And so together, these local business owners and George set out to help people earn more so they'd have more to spend on Main Street. They started with what people knew best, farming. But they understood that they didn't know farming and that they needed to do this with the people, not for the people. So they joined with local farmers and sat down and figured out why families remained poor despite their hard work, and realized it was the crop farming model that folks used that gave people little or no income except at harvest time if harvest was good. And so the local business owners chipped in and they helped the local farmers add dairy and poultry farming so they'd have a more regular, reliable source of income. And the farms started doing better. And then they brought in some breeding stock to improve livestock quality. And they even became early adopters of some technology when they had received a shipment of frozen prize bull sperm from England, which they used to inseminate the local cows in order to improve the quality of the livestock that they had locally. Within a few years, those efforts produced $2 million in new income for the region. And $2 million doesn't sound like a lot today, but if you think of 1950s where you could buy a new car for $700 or $800, $2 million in new income spilling over into Main Street was a huge difference for the community. And with more money in their pockets, people shopped more in town, Main Street businesses prospered, and so they reinvested. They knew the local business owners, the Tupelo group, as they began to call themselves, and McLean and the business owners, reinvested some of those profits to build more human capital in the community, because they also had some small local manufacturers that were struggling because they needed higher skilled workers to compete in a rapidly industrializing world. So they got together and they created one of Mississippi's first racially desegregated school systems, realizing that they couldn't afford to leave half their population behind in schools that didn't educate people for the world of today and the world of tomorrow. They formed a community college focused on training their workers for their local industry. They even set up a region-wide independence grievance system because there were no unions operating in the South at that time, and they wanted to guarantee workers' rights and ensure workers would continue to do better and get a fair income for their wage so that they would continue to have the resources to spend in those businesses on Main Street. Tupelo also formed a development hub. Initially, that Tupelo group of McLean and business leaders led the charge, but they knew they needed more help and expertise to move things forward. Initially, some of that expertise was built in some of the local institutions that they were helping to build, like the community college and in the school system, but they knew they needed something more, something regular, and so they formed an organization they called CREATE. It was a local foundation that was formed to serve as a development hub and a source of seed capital. They put some of their money into it. Other people in the community began to do better and recognized that CREATE was a way that they could reinvest in their community. They began to put money into it. And ultimately, McLean donated the newspaper to CREATE to serve as an ongoing source of revenue and support. So what kind of a difference did all this work make in the community? Today, the Tupelo region is one of the most popular regions in the Southeast U.S. Lee County, which still only has a population of 72,000, has 52,000 jobs. Just a huge accomplishment for Lee County and Tupelo. Remembering that this was the poorest part of the poorest state in the Union in 1950, by 1999, the poverty rate was down to just 7%, compared to 16% for US and 22% for the state of Mississippi. And then in 2007, they hit what some of my friends call the Toyota lottery, but it wasn't a lottery at all because it wasn't something that happened by chance. Toyota picked Lee County for its new Toyota Corolla assembly plant. And they did that not because of incentives, not because the state gave them huge amounts of money, but they picked Lee County because it had the quality workforce, because that community college and that continued focus on educating its local people for highly skilled jobs had provided the kind of workforce that Toyota was looking for. And that workforce supported a host of industries of the type that Toyota needed in order to be able to thrive in Lee County. So they ultimately, Tupelo, starting in 1950, over the course of 5 decades, almost 6 decades, came to the point where they got the biggest prize that most communities would give an arm and a leg for, and that was a major auto assembly plant. And they did that by starting at the bottom, building from the ground up with local people, with collective leadership, building on their assets, and creating a development hub that would organize the efforts. So next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about West Central Minnesota, where I spent 27 years of my life. West Central Minnesota borders North and South Dakota. In the northwest corner, that little dip in the green county on the map, Clay County, is where Fargo, North Dakota abuts it. That little point in Traverse County is literally the continental divide between the Red River of the North flowing up into the Hudson Bay and the Missouri River and Mississippi rivers flowing down into the Gulf of Mexico. Otter Tail County and is a county of lakes. Becker County is a county with its about 2/3 Native American White Earth Indian reservation. West Central Minnesota was built up in an agricultural economy in the agricultural boom days of the last part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. But with the beginning of mechanization of agriculture in the 1930s, it began a long population decline. By the 1980s, the major farm crisis in the 80s drove thousands more farmers out of business and out of the region to seek work in other places because there wasn't work on Main Street or in local industries to absorb the jobs lost by the workers. For every 3 farmers that were lost, communities lost another job on Main Street. The area also had a lot of small, mostly failing manufacturers. They were struggling, trying to get by. They weren't doing very well. And suicide rates really spiked with the farm crisis of the 80s. Hope was very hard to find in the community. And in fact, in many of the communities, as I drive through them, you could see people who hung out signs saying, "Last one out, turn out the lights." The despair was rampant in the area. So in 1985, a major foundation that had Minnesota as its focus area, the McKnight Foundation, supported a participatory planning process to examine what the region needed to recover and rebuild its economy. McKnight's focus was all of Minnesota, but it did very little grant making outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul. It saw the farm crisis. It understood that people were hurting, but it didn't know how to help because it didn't have boots on the ground in greater Minnesota. It didn't really have connections to those communities. So they decided that participatory planning, getting the people together to find out what they needed, was the way to figure out how they might be able to make a difference. And that planning process brought forward 2 main focus areas: economic development, to create jobs and reduce unemployment, something the McKnight Foundation had never done, and education and human services, so working parents could do better in their local jobs. Workforce training, childcare, other services and supports, so that people could go to work and that they could thrive in the work that they did. And it also identified the need for capacity and expertise for a development hub, essentially, although it wasn't called that then. So McKnight helped form a new regional organization, West Central Initiative, to plan and support the efforts. And volunteers from the planning process stepped up as its first board of directors. From the outset, this wasn't something that an external foundation was funding by itself, but it was something that local people were expected to contribute to and support and make their organization and use their assets to support. So from the outset, West Central Initiative did work from local assets. They decided to build on the remaining assets in their community to help small, struggling manufacturing companies do better, to refocus what was a very good K-12 and post-secondary school system, but which exported almost all its kids and trained them for jobs that didn't exist in the region, and to work on changing that system so those who might aspire to stay in the region could be trained for job opportunities that existed in the region. And it worked to enable local people to invest and contribute in a better future. So it gave them a vehicle, a place where people could pool their resources to do the things that they needed to lift themselves up. The primary strategy of West Central Initiative was to address the major problems identified by local manufacturers, to provide technical expertise to help them modernize their production, to provide loan capital because the major banks had pulled out, the banks had consolidated, many had closed, and it was almost impossible to get a business loan in the region. So to provide loan capital to help them modernize, to buy the equipment, to provide the working capital that they'd need in order to become more competitive, and to train the workforce for modern technology and production methods. So they leveraged the local contributions that were received from people who cared and opened their wallets to attract grants and outside support. And so West Central Initiative became the development hub for the region. It took on regional economic development and transportation planning, brought together local people to prepare those plans. The transportation planning had been done by the state without any regard to the local economy, and with local people leading that. The roads were actually being invested in ways that made a difference for the business community and the health of communities over the long term, rather than on moving people through the region on Interstate 94. They gained designation by the state as the Regional Economic Development Organization for that region, and that allowed them to apply for and become the only non-governmental organization at that time in the U.S. that became federally recognized as an economic development district. Becoming recognized as an economic development district opened additional doors for federal resources. They attracted state and federal fund for local development priorities, including what ultimately, within about 15 years, became a $10 million business revolving loan fund, and a $40 million endowment that was raised primarily from people in the region who cared about the region and wanted to provide seed capital in order for the region to be able to take on its challenges. They partnered with Manufacturing Extension, which is a federally funded program which hadn't been operating in the region because the federal model required local match, and local businesses couldn't afford to pay the match. So by the West Central Initiative helping the businesses with the match, we're able to bring in technical assistance to the region to help those companies in the region get world-class assistance on how they could modernize their technology and their productivity systems. They attracted and channeled seed capital for workforce training to help meet the needs of those manufacturers. They retooled the K-12 and technical education system by providing funding to those the K-12 and technical and community colleges to change their curriculum to focus on jobs in the region. Created a public-private regional workforce development partnership that was unlike anything that had been done previously in Minnesota, and created a Family Economic Success Council so families who were struggling could advise on how to provide resources that would help move those families forward out of poverty into jobs. So the results for West Central Minnesota: Well, in 1986, when we started this all, there were 195,000 people in the region. The population was trending down. Population was expected to get down to about 160,000 by 2010. Had the lowest wages of 11 regions in Minnesota. There were 4,345 manufacturing jobs in a region with 195,000 people. So there were some jobs, but not a lot. The average manufacturing weekly wage, about $365 a week, was very low for manufacturing. And unemployment rate in the region was 13%. Fast forward to 2010. With consistent investment, the employment picture changed. Because the employment picture changed, more people came back to the region. The population actually went up. Instead of the projected 160,000 people, by 2010, there were 215,000 people living in the region and more coming in every day. The wages went from lowest in the state to sixth out of 11 regions in Minnesota. Manufacturing jobs increased to more than 10,000. Now remember, 2010 was on the backside and before a full recovery from the Great Recession. So more than doubling in manufacturing jobs, despite the fact that the Great Recession had occurred, was a phenomenal accomplishment. Average weekly manufacturing wage more than doubled to $761, which was more of a respectable number. Unemployment, even without fully recovering from the Great Recession, was still only 5%. During this 24-year period, national manufacturing employment declined by about a third, 33%, while regional manufacturing employment more than doubled, went up 104%. National manufacturing wages fell behind inflation by 7.1%. And regional manufacturing wages did more than 20% better, and they outpaced inflation by 13%. But more than that, a region of 210,000 people created 35,000 additional jobs. Tremendous success story. Again, driven by collaborative leadership, an assets approach, and the creation of a rural development hub to help lead it all. So lessons, there were some lessons that you can learn from Tupelo, West Central Minnesota, and others that have done similar things. And the first is a good crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Tupelo was in crisis. It was dying. West Central Minnesota was in crisis for the farm crisis. Communities don't generally change much during a long, slow decline. People don't change much usually during a long, slow decline. It takes a good crisis to precipitate the energy and perhaps the panic that it takes for people to really dig in and tackle changes in their community. So we're living in a good crisis, or maybe a bad crisis, but it would be terrible to waste the opportunity that we have from our current crisis and not capitalize on it to help improve our communities. Effective development starts with local people, local ideas, local assets. It's not copying what somebody else did. It's not bringing in somebody from outside to fix your community. It's not getting the next big grant. It's really starting with what you have and growing it. Effective development starts with asking people what's holding them back and then actually listening to what they tell you. And once they've told you what's holding them back and you've listened, people will work with you to take what you have in your community to make what you need for your place. And remember that revitalization is a long-term effort. The Tupelo story that I told you, it was more than 50 years between when they began work and when they got the Toyota plant. West Central Minnesota had some early wins, began to see some changes in just a few years, as did Tupelo. But the long-term results, the 35,000 jobs, happened over 24 years. It took decades for most rural communities that are declining to get into the sad shape that they are today. It takes decades to fully recover. But if you don't start, it will never happen. And there are some common pitfalls that to avoid when you're trying to do this work. The first is getting so caught up in your planning that you don't do anything. Sometimes we plan, and we just don't get going on things. But every community has got some low-hanging fruit. Some things that the community would like to see happen, even if it's just painting the storefronts on Main Street, that will make people feel good, that will give people the energy to keep going. So yes, do your planning, but do get started on the low-hanging fruit. Start on something that you can claim as a success. And then there's the opposite pitfall, and it's getting so caught up in what you're doing that you don't plan. There are some issues in a community that are going to take years to deal with. They're the tough nuts to crack, but they're the things that will make the biggest difference. So if you don't start, if you don't plan to deal with the big things, you'll never take them on. So you need to do from early on, but you need to plan and not just do. Taking shortcuts on participation are probably the third common pitfall I see. There are groups in most communities that are left out, that are always left out. Or people think, oh, we've got enough of a leadership group. We got a half a dozen. We believe what Margaret Mead said about a small group of people changing the world, and don't realize that in a small town, a small group of people aren't going to change the world if everybody isn't following them, because it takes the whole town to make things change. The people must own the process or they'll walk away from it. And so you really need to be highly participatory. Make sure that everyone is invited to show up at the table if you really want to start a community revitalization effort that will gain traction over time and make the kind of difference that we just described in Tupelo or in West Central Minnesota. So to wrap all this up, rural places that do best over time: exercise collaborative leadership, use an asset approach like WealthWorks, build a development hub to organize and sustain that work. And if the poorest county in the poorest state in the union can make this work, so can you. I'm leaving you with a few resources. My presentation will be posted online after everything is done, as will a recording. But if you go and download the presentation, you'll also get a bonus. And that's a third story, and that's Ord, Nebraska, which we didn't have time for here today. But Ord is a place where, despite the community having been taken over by Posse Comitatus and John Birch anti-tax forces who didn't want to spend a dime on anything, local leaders reclaimed their community, took it over, redeveloped it, and it's another great story. We have a set of slides describing that and a link to more information as well. Thanks for listening. I hope you had a great day. I surely did. And welcome back, Marianne.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you very, very much. I agree with a lot of the comments. It was awesome. And you did a great job. I appreciate the wisdom that can come from somebody who's worked so closely with communities over time. And I'm grateful for you sharing that with us. I also appreciate, for those who heard both the morning and the afternoon keynotes, how much overlap there is in the themes from people who have done deep work in communities and the lessons that they've learned and the themes that have come out of that. So I hope that people really, really caught on to those. Just in closing, I just wanted to say, not only do we live in challenging times, but it's easy to argue that so very many of these challenges rise to the level of crisis. We have fires, we have elections, we have policing, we have hurricanes, we have a pandemic, we have deep inequality of so many different sorts. So not are we only, facing all these crises, but I think for me, I just feel how deeply we're facing them while deeply divided. And I think the thing that's hit me today, after a day just filled with ideas and solutions that we can all agree are good ideas and good solutions, that I'm leaving filled with optimism. And I think from our opening keynote through the sessions of the day to our closing keynote, I am reminded of Stephen Covey's idea from his book. I'm probably very loosely organizing it, but his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend it. But his idea was that you simply start where you're at. And if you start where you're at and you're good at it, you kind of expand your sphere of influence and you expand your sphere of influence. So, I'll close saying, may we live in times where this accelerated change results in an accelerated rate of change for the better. And I look forward to hearing from you how your work and your growing spheres of influence converge into radical change for our rural communities. Thank you so very much for being here, and I hope that you enjoy your evening. Have a good one. Bye-bye.